present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, claiming these territories to be part of his rightful Timurid inheritance. And by 1526, Babur established himself in Delhi and Agra after the Battle of Panipat, and this is the date usually that scholars consider the beginning of the Mughal dynasty. So we're dealing here with a dynasty that was Sunni Muslim, Central Asian, also Turco-Mongol, and then after marriages with local aristocracy, also partially Indian, that was ruling a majority of a population who was mostly Hindu, but there were also Jains, Zoroastrians, and some Jews and Christians. It was under the reign of the third Mughal ruler, Emperor Akbar, Babur's grandson, that the empire became a major power in the region and beyond. Its wealth, relative stability, economic ties, and religious and cultural atmosphere attracted numerous learned people, artists, and professionals of all sorts. In the years around 1600, Iranians, Central Asians, Turks, Indians from the Deccan, Hindu Rajas from Gujarat, Rajasthan, Bengal, Portuguese Jesuits, and European traders were among those gathered at the North Indian court of Akbar. One of the richest and most cosmopolitan courts of the time, it also attracted poets, painters, calligraphers, and musicians seeking prestige patronage. Akbar's workshops were among the largest known at the time, employing more than 100 artists. They produced numerous illustrated manuscripts of different kinds, as well as single-page paintings meant for albums. The illustrated manuscripts from the 1580s onwards evinced innovative features with respect to their urban landscape background. And just to show you an example of what was happening before the 1580s and afterwards, in order to kind of set our eyes and see what is the difference that I'm talking about. So on the left you have a page from the Anvari Suhaili, and if you focus on the upper part of the composition and compare it to this one, you will see really major differences in terms of the intricate working of the background. One is less intricate, and the difference in details and also perception of the space and distance between these two images is really striking. What prompted the creation of cityscape painting in the Mughal realm, and what is precisely represented in these vignettes? I look at the urban scenes from a new perspective, using Mughal topographical writing, descriptions of cities and architecture, in order to understand the meaning of this microarchitecture landscape. I argue that these metropolitan vignettes should be viewed as reflecting the Mughal sense of ownership and pride in the land of Hindustan, their complete establishment in the subcontinent, and their socioeconomic success from the end of the 16th and early 17th centuries. Grappling with the relationship between categories of analysis, I divide the Indian urban scenes into two main types. One in which the architecture is part of the narrative, and another that is superfluous, where no specific site is linked directly to the moment depicted in the story. Today I shall focus on the latter group, where the architecture is not text-dependent. In these mini-urban topographies, we find the following elements clustered together, forming some sort of a metropolis constellation. And I'm going to show these images vis-a-vis actual buildings from the period of Akbar in order to establish their conceptual modulation and translation, as well as to assert their vernacular character. So we have buildings made out of red sandstone, which is the hallmark of Mughal architecture. Some buildings are completely white, depicted in white, and perhaps representing marble or whitewash. And also, these types of buildings also represent usually Hindu shrines or temples, and you can see the women prostrating. We have city walls with turrets, and it's interesting to look at the patterns on the walls here, also the turrets on the sides, and also the main gate, the main entrance gate into these complex appear in these walled cities. The use of chatrias in open pavilion or kiosks. And I'm looking into these kind of images that appear here and here. And also, if you look at another comparison, the kind of angular symmetry that the artist captured in those illustrations is very interesting vis-a-vis the architecture. And we also have architecture with pointed domes with finials. And this is an easy comparison. And this is an interesting type of building that we have that displays a three-dome structure, perhaps alluding to a mosque. And you can see here, 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 and also here. We also have buildings with corbels, this detail. And also we have richly ornamented carved piers, columns, and tower-like structures. And this is a very interesting detail with this motif here vis-a-vis the tomb of the Sheikh Salim Chishti in Fatehpur Sikri. And then tower-like structure, this is the Kawat al-Islam. And you have these kind of towers that appear in a lot of those compositions. We may conclude by saying that when examining images of the Mughal microarchitecture more closely, two things become clear. One, the majority of them, the Indian artists, for the majority of them, the Indian artists utilize vocabulary that is based on local Mughal architecture. Many of the elements can be found in royal buildings and complexes such as Akbar's Fatehpur Sikri. Most of the monuments, and the second one is that most of the monuments represent illusory architectural elements that pretend to belong to a Mughal physical reality. The emphasis in the Mughal paintings is not only on the architecture, but also on cities, walled cities. In art historical narrative, the change in landscape or cityscape depictions in India has been attributed to the meeting of Mughal painters with European art. Up until now, scholars have explained the existence of these receding backgrounds with microarchitecture in relations to Renaissance painting, especially Netherlandish art, and illustrated book of hours. And the pairs that I'm going to show you now with the European comparisons are pairs that appear in a lot of articles and scholarly works. This is what you see. This is the kind of standard comparison. So usually you have, this is taken from a full page representation, but what you get in the material, in the scholarly publications, are these kind of cropped images that perhaps reinforce, in order to reinforce the argument of some kind of a relationship between these two. And scholars were talking about the composition and the similarity between the structures and the trees and the landscape between these kind of images. Many of the links or perceived replications between Eastern and Western materials that art historians have recognized were based on visual comparisons in an effort to identify European originals that most probably inspired Mughal patrons and artists to produce works of art like this. Moreover, scholars tend to see these depicted structures as essentially European and suggest a European origin for the Mughal landscape. But I think that they're not seeing the forest for the trees. One specific example that has been argued to make a great impact on Mughal art is the Polyglot Bible. This Bible was printed in Antwerp by Christopher Plantin in 1569 to 72. The first Jesuit mission brought it to Emperor Akbar's court in 1580. And of course, this is not mentioned in Mughal sources, but it is mentioned by the Jesuits. Susan Strong, for example, claims that the first title page of Volume 1 of the Polyglot Bible, which depicts a harbor landscape in the background, have inspired the inclusion of Portuguese ships sailing near rocky landscapes studded with buildings in the Victorian Albert Harivancha picture. And just to explain to you the context, this is a page from a manuscript that is dealing with So there are strong argues that this is coming from what we see here. But if you start looking at the details, if we look more closely, we may notice a visual link on a certain level. They both show ships, water, diagonal hill range with microarchitecture, but there is no mistaken one for the other. And you can see in the Mughal painting, you can see very specifically the mosque type, perhaps the shrine. There is another one here, and the different trees that are depicted. So perhaps the connection is more to the ships, but even if you look at the ships, they're very different from one another. And so that doesn't really work. And I think that there is even less connection with respect to the terrain and the architecture. Other scholars link the phenomenon of miniature urban landscape to Netherlandish paintings, as well as to images in the Christian Book of Hours. They refer more specifically to the calendaric representations of the labors of the month, which is a well-known iconographic cycle in European visual tradition. Based on that, they describe these Indian urban landscapes as a mélange of European visual tradition, of a European and Mughal representation. But I argue that, and they argue that the Mughal artists borrowed this microarchitecture tradition from similar representations in the Christian prayer book. So they're thinking about, they mentioned the bridge here and the bridge here, the kind of meandering composition that we can see here, the use of water, as well as here, and the people with the vegetation. But also another thing that is important to remember about this book of ours, that in several cases, this landscape and these architectures are very specific and connected to a very specific locale and to the estate of the patron in many times. And this is really not what is happening here. We cannot locate that into a specific place. So that's a great difference between these two. This approach of comparing the European and Mughal representations may help us imagine what kind of European materials circulated at the Mughal workshops, since we have very little concrete physical and textual evidence of the kind of Renaissance images that arrived at or produced by Europeans in India. But here we're also getting to the heart of the problem, the Eurocentric perspective which characterized scholarly work on Mughal art. And behind this approach stands the belief that the Renaissance artist was perceived as a master and a genius. And how could a Mughal painter compete with such high intellectual creations? At issue is the assumption that Mughal artists lacked originality, understanding, and consciousness when they copied or imitated European art. However, the opposite is true. Indian artists and patrons were not interested in converting to Christianity, as the Jesuits constantly tell us, or in replicating Renaissance art, nor were they smitten with European culture. Their sense of the global was related to their multifaceted imperial identity, expressed through conscious expansion of religious and socio-cultural horizons. I view the connection between the Indian panoramas and the European material as more nuanced, interlaced. It is difficult to see a one-to-one copy or a straightforward systematic relationship between the European and the Mughal paintings. And I would like to bring another perspective to the discussion, one that considers Mughal writings about cities and to examine the microarchitectural vistas in light of these texts. I also just want to clarify that I'm not denying the relationship to European art. Rather, I would like to create a shift in the perspective and interpretation of East-West encounters, giving agency to Mughal patrons and artists. This is a story not only about the diffusion and incorporation of European imagery, but also about the negotiation of political hierarchy, religious order, philosophical, and artistic choices. several examples that we have seen, it appears that these vignettes construct some sort of a typology of an imagined Mughal metropolitanism. In order to understand these conspicuous displays of constructed urbanism, I believe that we need to turn to Mughal sources and use them as a framework of discussions of and commentaries on places. At Emperor Akbar's request, the historian Amin Ahmed Razi composed the Haft Iklim, 7 Climes, in 1594, a work that celebrates the regions of the world and introduces each major city with a description of its unique architectural structures. When the author describes Delhi, which lies in the 3rd climb, he emphasizes its splendid monuments and edifices. About Ahmedabad, the capital of Gujarat, Razi states that, and I quote, "The city is exceptional in the craftsmanship and elegance of its architecture and buildings, and its marketplace, the bazaar, in contrast to those of other Indian cities, is extremely vast and neat, where perfectly decorated shops of 2 or 3 stories have been constructed," end of quote. Based on Mughal sources, a city in India would oftentimes include walls, gates, green areas, towers, and noticeable monuments such as mosques, shrines, palaces, etc. And if you look at these kind of depictions, you see exactly the same kind of emphasis and ideas. And here's what Abul Fazl, the chief historian and close confidant of Akbar, has to say about Agra. Agra is a large city and possesses a healthy climate. The river Yamuna flows through it, and on either bank are delightful villas and pleasant stretches of meadow. It is filled with people from all countries, and it is the emporium of the traffic of the world. His Majesty Akbar has built a fort of red stone, of the like of which travelers have never recorded. It contains more than 500 buildings of masonry, after the beautiful designs of Bengal and Gujarat, which masterly sculptors and artists of form have fashioned as architectural models. At the eastern gate, there are 2 elephants of stone with their riders graven with exquisite skill. Abul Fazl is keen on describing the cultural affluence of the empire through prominent display of its architectural magnificence. He is well aware of the sophistication with which the buildings were designed, and he is eager to comment on the impact they had on international audiences, travelers, as well as local practitioners. The movement of people and the diversity of the population are also important paradigms in the descriptions of city, and it is clearly reflected in these mini-urban vignettes as part of the typology of Mughal metropolitanism. We may notice various travelers coming and going, religious figures, ascetics, foreigners, people playing, working the land. And you see all of that here. For example, we have a Nath yogi walking here, people are coming and going, someone perhaps playing, and definitely someone working the land, the different classes of society with the different activities. In addition to descriptions of buildings and monuments, an integral part of Mughal accounts of cities is its abundance and quality of fruit, grains, and flowers. For example, Abul Fazl says about Allahabad that it has, and I quote, "a stone fort that was completed recently, as well as many handsome edifices with a certain shrine that the Hindus regard as the king of shrines." He further states that Allahabad's climate is healthy. It produces a variety of fruits, flowers, and garden herbs, and he talks a lot about the scent that comes from these herbs. And it always has an abundant supply of melons and grapes, also very important in the diet. These ideas and descriptions of the city as organism resonate in the painting, portraying a whole cluster of buildings, agricultural activities, lush vegetation, along with characters like a Nath yogi and other travelers. Although topographical works flourished under the Mughals, art historians suggested that the Indian artists were inspired by and adopted the European concept of the so-called Weltlandschaft, the world landscape, and like their European counterparts, created not individual but European landscapes. However, the sum total of the Mughal examples, both literary and visual, might convey the complexity of these cultural contexts and the Mughals' intricate negotiation of localism and cosmopolitanism in these works of art. Likewise, when thinking about these suggested parallels between European and Indian artistic creations, the context of the Mughal urban landscape is very different from the European ones. The Indian paintings appear in illustrated historical texts such as the Baburnameh, the Akbarnameh, literature, prose, and poetry such as the Khams of Nizami, the Khams of Pahlavi, works by Saadi, the fables of Danbari Suhaili. I can give you a long, long list here. They do not form part of religious books like the Book of Hours, Christian oil paintings, or devotional prints, and they are not intended to be used in that way. I argue that the Indian mini-urban topographies portray physical settings that are linked to the Mughal-built world. The reconfiguration of urban motifs into Indian idioms altered their former Christian European context and therefore reflects Mughal territorial geography, identity, and their sense of pride and ownership towards Hindustan. Another explanation that has been offered regarding the appearance of miniature architecture in Mughal painting is linked to the inquisitory personalities of Mughal emperors and their interest in the environment and the natural world. The Mughals, writers, and rulers have been associated with paying much attention to their surroundings and geography. Scholars have often fall back on Babur's descriptions of cities, flowers, and animals in his autobiographical memoirs, the Baburnameh, as the impulse behind depictions of landscape, animals, and buildings. Looking at Mughal geographical writings from a historical perspective, it is worth understanding that their interest in surveys of places, flora, and fauna is concurrent with traditional writing of histories in the Muslim sphere. This can be seen in Rashid al-Din's Jami al-Tawrikh, which include an entire volume dedicated to geography, or in Khandamir's history, Habib Siyar, that contains geographical descriptions of the layout of the land, climate, cities, important monuments, vegetation, and peoples. The inclusion of such elements is a traditional part of historical writing, and as could be expected, these literary preferences were further reflected in visual terms. The work of the famous Timurid artist Behzad from the end of the 15th century has been characterized with naturalism, including the depictions of everyday activities and emphasizing the diversity of figures and that populate his compositions, as noticed by David Roxburgh. All things considered, framing the Mughal historio-topographical and visual interests in similar ideas, their preferences for depictions of cities, monuments, and the land are not so peculiar. At the same time, praising India's architecture, urban centers, and nature has not always been the norm for the Mughals. In earlier times, Babur, who liked to complain about everything in the subcontinent, wrote in his memoirs that Hindustan is a place of little charm. There is no beauty in its people, no graceful social intercourse, no poetic talent or understanding, no etiquette, nobility, or manliness. The art and crafts have no harmony or symmetry. However, feeling of belonging and identity have shifted dramatically with Akbar, and the poetry that was commissioned by the emperor and the Mughal nobility was in praise of India and its cities. Sunil Sharma argues that under Akbar and Jahangir, court poets were commissioned to write topographical literature praising the new monuments and, I quote, translating the vision of a new building or city into the discursive realm of poetry, end of quote. In Indo-Persian literature, authors celebrated the architectural achievements of a particular city and praised cities as thriving centers of power, commerce, and culture. Unlike their Iranian counterparts, Mughal writers were more intent on emphasizing the multicultural fabric of their societies. I just want you to pay attention that there are also Europeans that appear here. Muhammad Arif, who was another historian writing under Akbar's period, describes the capital city of Agra as, and I quote, a flourishing large city that offers abundance of security for all inhabitants under the expanse of heaven, end of quote. The city includes numerous monuments, gardens, ships flowing up and down the river, and the author further remarks that the multitude of foreigners from all sorts of nations, from the corners of the four sides of the world, have gathered for trade and fulfillment of necessities in such a country that the Dar al-Khilafah of Agra has become all of India, end of quote. The descriptions of prosperous gardens and public spaces in the capital city enhance our notion of abundance and diversity, not only with respect to Agra itself, but also regarding the empire and the Mughal world as a whole. Emphasizing India's position as a global international center formed an important part of the ruling elite's vision of themselves and their domain. These notions are further reflected in paintings, and of course you can identify the different monuments with a dome and the different kind of styles of paintings, perhaps of architecture, perhaps also including some European style buildings. Beyond the encyclopedic interest in their domains, these images and writings are representations of Mughal dominance. Unlike Babur, who disliked the idea of being in India, this is Mughal territorial identity that is also reflected in historical writing. I would like to argue that behind these territorial interests lies Akbar's religio-political ideology, which crystallized in the 1580s, 1590s. The representations of different buildings in the cityscape, linked to Hindu temples, mosques, and perhaps European-style structures, represent a diverse population and groups under Mughal rule. As such, the timing of the appearance of these depictions corresponds to the formation and establishment of Akbar's new policy of tolerance, the Sulh-i-Kul. This change in social order, governance, and ideology is, to my mind, at the core of Mughal visions of India, and these new ideas were expressed in writings and in painting. Beginning in the 1580s, Akbar adopted a policy called Sulh-i-Kul, which is peace for all or universal peace, which was an approach of inclusion for the local non-Muslim population. According to Sulh-i-Kul proposition, peoples of different faiths were free to practice their own religions, some became part of Akbar's nobility, and several were allowed to partake in the political, administrative, and cultural life of the empire. Akbar made policy changes that were rooted in the idea of creating balance and harmony among the different religions and ethnic communities within his empire. To that end, he developed a more equalized system of government, abolishing various taxes on non-Muslims and opening both his administration and army to Hindus and other non-Muslims. And why would he need to do such a thing? As to begin with, Akbar was ruling over a population that was mostly Hindu, people who were considered infidels, kafirun, in the eyes of Islam. And how could he be considered a Muslim king if he is ruling a majority of the population that is kafirun? And how could the emperor establish his authority in this multi-confessional, multilingual empire? Also because according to the strict Sharia law, Islamic law, infidels who come under Muslim rule face two difficult options: either convert to Islam, and there were instances of forced conversion, not too many in the Mughal Empire earlier on in Akbar's reign, or be format of Surhikur, Akbar goes against the traditional ulama, the religious authorities. He recognized that if his empire was to succeed, he had to devise a different religio-political approach than the Sharia. His notion was to create a non-sectarian and open-ended cultural politics with the endeavor of balancing the conflicting claims of different communities. Muzaffar Alam argues that Surhikur was possible in Mughal India not only because of Akbar's ideas, but also because of the tradition of diversity in the subcontinent, where communities of different beliefs and social practices had learned to live together, their clashes notwithstanding. Since Mughal India was a complex place, we must understand Akbar's embrace of Surhikur not only in spiritual terms, but also as part of the transformation of his nobility to include diverse Orthodox Muslim communities and other groups such as Shiite Iranians, Rajput Hindus. We can start comprehending how these ideas may explain the appearance of praises of the cosmopolitan urban centers in poetry and paintings at the same time. And if you see, again, we're looking at another aesthetic figure, right, and the different kind of buildings, and this kind of cosmopolitan atmosphere of the city and the balance and the harmony that is created based on that. And I think that these kind of diversification of these representations are specifically connected to the Surhikur. In a letter to the Safavid king of Iran, Shah Abbas, Akbar wrote, "Kings must pacify the hearts of people of all sects in accordance with the principles of Surhikur, as the divine mercy attaches itself to every form of creed. It must be borne in mind that divine graciousness and mercy are open to all creeds, and one should exert oneself to the utmost to bring oneself into the garden of Surhikur. Hence it is only proper that kings who are the shadows of God should not give up on this practice." And it's interesting that he's saying kings are the shadows of God. And if we're thinking about this kind of harmony, balance, cosmopolitanism, again, you can see the Europeans here, different kind of people that are coming and going, the movement of people, and the balance between nature and architecture. Akbar's portrayal of Surhikur is very similar to descriptions of an ideal society and its hierarchy, as formulated by the medieval philosopher and scientist Nasser ad-Din Tusi and his composition Akhlaq-i Nasiri. And here I would like to add another tier to the multi-layered complexity and discuss Akbar's notions of right governance that were related to Akhlaqi literature and the people of the virtuous city. Much of Akbar's policy and the writing of his official historian and close confidant Abul Fazl can be directly linked to the work of the medieval philosopher and scientist, Tusi's work. The Akhlaq-i Nasiri was composed in Persian in the 13th century, and it is a theoretical idealistic work on ethics, economics, and politics. It specifically outlines the moral behaviors of the individual as well as the ruler, and the just organization of the society, the city, and the state, and it also has a cosmic level to it. Much of it's linked to the teachings of the pre-Islamic Persian Greek philosophers and Persians, intertwined with discussions and interpretations of Quranic verses, and in generally scholars categorize it as belonging to the mirror for princes genre. During Akbar's reign, Al-Tusi's text had become part of the curriculum at the court. It was widely circulated, and there is a lavishly illustrated copy that belonged to Akbar's library that had 17 paintings. And I'm just showing off this painting because this is part of the Akhlaq-i Nasiri manuscript. It's a very famous painting in Mughal art, and I could not pass the opportunity to show it off. But this is part of one of the manuscripts that were circulating at the court. Other Akhlaqi works by Timurid authors were also such as the Ahlaki Humayuni, and there are other texts, similar texts. According to Al-Tusi and reiterated by Abu al-Fazl, the ultimate ruler is the philosopher king, and his governance is based on justice. And justice meant to ensure the effective authority of the king, well-being of the citizens, the subjects, and prosperity of the country. Therefore, justice is defined as, and I quote, social harmony, a coordinated balance of the conflicting claims of diverse interest groups, which could well belong to more than one religion in an ideal state. End of quote. Cooperation is a key word, and the rights of the subjects are not related to their religion. Al-Tusi describes the ideal city, which he calls the virtuous city, Madinah Fadila, as a combination of people whose aspirations are fixed on the acquisition of goods and the removal of evils. They appear to differ in community and doctrine, but, and I quote, the people of the virtuous city, albeit diversified throughout the world, are in reality agreed, for their hearts are upright one towards another, and they are adorned with love for each other. End of quote. This is very similar to the Mughal description of Sulh-i-Kul. And again, they're both talking about the establishment of authority not through power but through love and affection. In the virtuous city, and I quote, there will be no prejudice or concentration among them, as long as they follow the leadership of the just ruler. End of quote. I believe that the microarchitecture and landscape in the background of these paintings, dating from the 1590s, represent these ideals of diversity, social order, and tolerance, which Akbar made to be his policy. So when I look at these kind of representations, the harmony between the nature and the built world, the various people, the different kind of monuments that are related to all the different traditions, for me, this is a reflection of the virtuous city and the Sulh-i-Kul ideas that Akbar has been, and the court have been promoting. In prosperous times, the city was the location of patronage networks and a cosmopolitan center of cultural life, writes Sunil Sharma. The Mughals' feelings towards Hindustan reflect a regional enthusiasm that appears to be deeply intertwined with the Mughal celebration of their own cosmopolitanism, Ahlaki cosmopolitanism, the two not being seen as mutually exclusive. By the end of the 17th century, Corinne Lefebvre states, it was Mughal dominance that had allowed Hindustan to thrive to the extent of becoming the new center of the early modern world, or at least of the Persianate realm, a transformation in which the dynasty took no small pride. This amalgamation of local and universal, ideal and concrete, mixed with success and pride of the Mughal elite, is manifested in the microarchitecture representations. By making these transcreations, and by this term I mean the translation and reconfiguration of artistic concepts from one context to another, the artists innovatively combined images and topoi, conceiving illusory architectural elements to appear as if belonging to a physical reality with the buildings and gardens of a city. The successful and intricate combination of localism and Ahlaki cosmopolitanism promoted by the Mughals seems to have constituted the ultimate standard of the dynasty cultural pluralism as it developed from the late 16th century onwards. Thank you.
Time for a good number of questions, so please, who would like to begin?
Have you noticed the difference of painting?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that the difference of painting technique in this kind
The
of
difference
micro
in what?
painting technique in the same miniature compared to the lower main areas, because they seem to be all like, especially this kind of the landscape seems to be done with a gradation of color, which we don't always see in the, at least the Persian world. It seems to the use of the landscape and the color technique in the application of in the miniature seems to have come from perhaps a European source.
I haven't looked at it yet because for me color is connected to perspective and the way they're employing perspective or manipulating perspective, and that is the second part of the chapter that I haven't gotten yet.
Okay. Just the comparison
But that's a very good point.
with the Ottomans, which was happening a little bit earlier in the starting from the early 16th century. Not as detailed and not as these type of cityscapes, but little vignettes of in the background with a few people, sometimes more. Again, with that type of landscape use comes this type of color usage, which is a different use compared to the Persian.
If you're talking about the bluish,
Blue,
yeah,
you know, so and
definitely that is definitely connected to the Netherlandish tradition. That's something that I see clearly. But if you're looking at the part below it, what is below the blue, then I don't
yeah,
see
no, I
so
mean
much. But the really, really top one, yes. The kind of receding atmospheric perspective that they're creating with the color. Yeah. David.
Hey, thank you. No, I really appreciate your talk and this effort to talk in a more detailed and sustained way about the landscapes, the backgrounds to the narratives, which tend to attract more attention, and revising the this maybe in a quite slightly belated way art historically, but that reflects maybe the Mughal painting field more than anything else. Putting the European material to one side as the prime mover in what happens in the landscape. But I'm sort of thinking, you present a very convincing case for how it is that the landscape reflects local topography conditions and also morphological aspects of Mughal architecture in this late Akbari through early Jahangiri period. And yet I can't think of a single instance, well maybe one or two, in the art of the book where the representation of landscape does anything other than show a real world that is available and that has the index of the local reflected in it. So that would need to be, I think, developed in a stronger way. And then the other aspect, which has to do with landscape, is it may just be our own somewhat traumatic experience of the effects of urbanism on landscape and the management of landscape, because these seem to be such wonderful, lovely places that we'd all like to live in. But also the idea of, the taking something like the work of ethics, either the Nasirian ethics, or you could think of the Akhlaq-i Muhsini as the latest Timurid version, and thinking about modelling an economy and the ruler's role with respect to governing a landscape, you would think that this would also be just a completely normal and acceptable understanding of the representation of landscape in the Mughal painting. So again, how do you make that causal relationship stronger? Mm-hmm. And then a third question would be, that, but what are the temporal implications of these the temporal implications of these representations of landscape? Because you have a groundedness and a locality and maybe a cosmopolitanism shown through the landscape and the architecture, and yet in every instance almost in every instance these are stores that are historically located, or they're works of poetry that are mythological and that were never to be understood as factual.
So I'll start with the first one.
I hope they were clear.
They're very clear, and I thank you for your questions. And I think that the difference that you see between what I showed with the Anvari Suhaili, for example, image, and what you see here is just for me, it's like day and night. Because one is really almost schematic, and there also in the early Mughal paintings, and not necessarily even in illustrated manuscripts, but in the Garden Party, for example, and other paintings, there is no interest in this kind of urban world, and not even specific interest in depicting the body trees and very special species that are connected to India. There is a landscape. It's a little bit more abstract, I would think. It's a little bit more imaginative in terms of identifying specific flowers and categories of plants and rocks that are connected to the place than what we see here. So I think that there is kind of a more focus and interest in the specific terrain and landscape of India, and that has not been before. So I do see a change. Look at the Hamzaname. You don't see the same kind of interest and appearance of India in the background as you see here. The second one was about the Akhlaq Nasiri and how it is more connected into what we see here, right? So there is a shift in policy. Akbar has not always been, there is this kind of image of Akbar in general literature, but also in some scholarly literature that likes to portray him as this very nice man who liked to hug everyone and liked every religion and was really interested in Hinduism and Jainism and all kinds of things. But maybe he was. But there is also a very practical aspect to that. And he had a switch. He had to learn this practical aspect throughout his reign. And he had to come to terms to realize that if he wants this thing to work, he needs to make a change. And then how does he make these changes without alienating the Muslim population and by creating this kind of inclusion? And the text that is constantly quoted by Abul Fazl in the Akbarnameh, and it's just stunning. Once you start reading the Akhlaq Nasiri and you go back to the Akbarnameh, just unbelievable to see those parallels. And there is also a big article by Muzaffar Alam about that. This is almost like copy and paste from the Akhlaq Nasiri. And so I think there is a very conscious decision to go by these kind of ideas, and then they also come into the paintings. So it's not just the kind of, and I see that you're not convinced.
No, I don't know yet.
How do I
Maybe,
know that? Because of
maybe.
the timing.
Mm-hmm.
By the time that he starts with the Sohikul policy that is based on Nasiri, a few years later, this is what you find in paintings. You don't see it beforehand. And this is exactly falls at the same time with the poetry and the other writings that are dealing with the cities and the terrain. So the timing of that tells me that something has changed, and this is connected to the change in policy. Otherwise, you're right, yes. It could be anything.
Mm-hmm.
But this comes in a very specific, you can really draw a line in Mughal painting and say, this is before, this is after. So for me, this is an indication that it is connected. I don't remember the third question.
We can talk about it later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Guru.
Maybe, I mean, I think what you say is very, I mean, it makes sense, but for someone who wants to doubt it, I think maybe you can introduce some comparisons that would show how different this is. So, for example, I was thinking the Ottomans also have the same text, and they developed a much more realistic kind of topographic painting much earlier, where you can actually identify certain cities and sites, whereas these, although individual buildings can be identified as Mughal, they are really idealized landscapes. So, I mean, I think these kinds of comparisons also maybe with a painting in the Deccan, where they might have, again, kind of localisms, but it's still though, I mean, one could, even when you make these comparisons not going to be very easy to pinpoint it with. I mean, you can say these were like parallel things happening. I completely understand the desire. And there is indeed, because of the idealization, a sense of real peacefulness too. So maybe that could be something to be emphasized. There is something very beautifully peaceful about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a very good point. So you think that if I compare to the Ottomans or the Safavids at the same time?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think also maybe within India, and also to make more, I mean, this is just like a technical thing that I'm saying, to show like earlier Mughal images and really convince the audience that this is really happening exactly at this time, which I'm sure you have looked at.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk, and I really enjoy your effort to shift the agency away from Europeans as the instigators of all the artistic changes at the Mughal court. But since you have, you seem to have a very sort of precise emphasis on timing, like when this philosophy becomes prominent at Akbar's court, and sort of when it shows up in painting. And because of that, what I kept wondering about was the dates, because a lot of the dates of the paintings you're showing are sort of late 1590s or in 1600, and Prince Salim rebels in 1599, and there's a lot of paintings that are being made at his independent atelier, and I wondered how you were going to engage with that, because the microarchitecture remains a theme throughout the Jahangiri period as well.
That's a great question. And indeed, in the Jahangiri in the Salim album, you don't see the same thing at all. It's not there. I actually looked at some. I was trying to find more images, and I was going again through the paintings from the Salim album, and you don't see the same landscape. You do see the individual figures of the yogis, etc. That you see, but not things like that at all. And it's also interesting to see that at the beginning of his reign, he does, if we can connect these manuscripts to his atelier and to the years that he was in rebellion, then there is, at the beginning, there is a continuation, but also the dates of some of these manuscripts are so flaky that that's a problem that I have. That, for example, there is one manuscript that is dating to 1604, not based on a colophon, and not based on any inscription. So I don't know who decided on this circa 1604 date, which is important because it's 1605 Akbar dies. So that's a thing.
And just following up on, you mentioned the Salim album, I also wondered, the Salim album is an album, and also most of your examples are from manuscripts, and if you have any...
The manuscripts also do not. The ones that are directly can be linked to his atelier in Ahmedabad, in Allahabad at the time, they do not show the same thing, which is interesting.
Thanks very much, Mika. Follow up on Bronwyn's question about John case. There's two questions come to mind. One would be, we saw mainly the non-historical manuscripts. I'm curious as to what you would say about the Akbarnama types of paintings, and whether you find variants or similar type of patterns, or you would guess with the kind of specificity of place and scene that it would be more complex. But the second piece of it is that this is a time when Akbar has shifted from more of the landscape in general terms to urbanism and urbanization and urban patronage. He's the one who makes that shift. I'm curious as to whether that shift is relevant for the frequency with which we see cities depicted in backgrounds, even as compared with later Shah Jahani painting, where you can have an agrarian scene, no city at all.
Right.
Just a thought.
Right. I didn't think about the last point, that he's shifting into more of architectural patronage at that point. And that could be really interesting. in terms of the historical manuscripts, you sometimes, it's interesting because you see the battle of this and this fort or this and this place, and if you look into details, you could see some more individualized characters of these depictions, but they still fall into these, they still kind of give a generic, oftentimes a generic kind of portrayal of a fort or another place. That's something that I need to look more into, but I on purpose did not want to go into the historical manuscripts because sometimes it's very easy to just fall into that idea that they are trying to portray an actual location. And sometimes they do that, but not always. In Jahangir's period, they do it much more. For example, from the Jahangirname, we have we have this image that actually shows in the background the tomb of Akbar and Sikandar, and that Robert Skelton identified. And that event took place exactly in that area, and the tomb is shown. So you do see a very specific representation of actual architecture that we can identify by view in terms of the landscape in historical manuscripts. So I'm on purpose avoiding that and pretending that it does not exist at the moment. But I probably should look into that again. Thank you.
Related to the third question that we didn't get to in this is what the kind of rationale for including these in these paintings are. And you didn't really give the, I have a feeling you have sort of propaganda in mind, but the other explanation is possibly it's seeping through or it's reflective of why include these at all? Why not just have a separate manuscript of Nasiruddin and Tusi where they've represented ideal cities?
They have separate manuscripts of Nasiruddin Tusi, and there are all kinds of scenes, different scenes that are represented there, and I think Maria Subtelli just gave a talk about it in the Aga Khan in Toronto, so we'll have to see what she says about that. But I think, and I don't see these as propaganda. Remember, these things do not widely circulate, right? It's for a very close and very exclusive audience, right? So I see them as more reflective of the policies and not as a propaganda, right? It's something that people are talking about at the court and in the workshops, and it's something that kind of disseminates from the administration, if you want, and the bureaucracy into different tiers in the empire, right? And that's how these kind of ideas circulate. It's not I don't see it as a kind of one-to-one thing.
In which case, then, the European argument does still work very well, that an artistic model for putting these cities there fits with.
But how? They really do not look alike.
Their existence at all, I guess.
That I don't see. That you'll have to convince me with that one.
Just one, you mentioned that the white ones, usually the white buildings represent Hindu buildings, or
With a specific shape, they have a temple. Yeah.
but one thing I noticed in the cityscapes is that, at least in the Akbari period, you would expect more red, and they have a lot of white actually, which is like before the invention of the addition of the white marble and so on. So in a way, even the colors seem not very naturalistic in a way, that they are, again, it ties into, they are not wanting, if they had wanted to, they would have represented actual cities as you showed.
Right.
So that would tie in with a
Yeah.
more metaphorical
Mhm.
idea, perhaps.
And I think they're trying to represent some kind of a mixture, but also we have to also remember that they think about it also as a composition. So there are also visual aspects that we have to take into account. But definitely, yes, there is. It's not a specific place, and it's not a real thing that we can say, oh, this is it.
I'm just following on, I'm glad you mentioned the compositional part, because one thing that struck me is that there'd be a lot of potential to talk about the representation of the city in compositional terms. And I haven't seen folks do that. I think you have made a good case by picking out elements of architecture in the city, but if we take the point that you made earlier about the various angular formations within these complexes, talking about that in some detail and with some attention to how things hold together through that, or form up as a cityscape, it would really be worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't done that, and that's a huge project that I'm also not going to do right now. That's for another project.
Well, fair enough. And thanks very much for your
Thank you all. Thank you very